Hello, everyone. The fourth grade team has decided for each teacher to read a novel of her choice. And the book that I have chosen is Wild Timothy by Gary L. Blackwood. I'm going to start chapter 1. The red nylon of the tent was closing in on him, nearly black in the darkness. For the third or fourth time, Timothy slipped his arm out of the sleeping bag and reached up to reassure himself that the tent was still where it should be, 3 feet or so above his head, and still stretched taut. The fabric felt damp, coated with his moist breath and his father's. Timothy felt suffocated, like he was breathing their old expended breath over and over again. Squirming half out of the sleeping bag, he lifted one corner of the tent flap and inhaled the cold breath which smelled of pine needles and moldy leaves. Then, chilled, he crawled back inside the mummy bag, wishing his father had let him bring his pajamas. The tent fabric acted something like a greenhouse, closing them in with their stale breath, yet failing to keep out the presence of the forest. It effectively screened out all the fresh air, but somehow every slightest noise seemed magnified, as though the tent walls vibrated in time with each owl's hoot and bobcat's scream. Timothy reached up to touch the nylon roof once more and then turned over and closed his eyes, waiting for sleep. Just when he had gotten more or less used to the various noises of the woods and had begun to drift off, he heard a noise, a guttural, bear-like woofing sound. Timothy's eyelids opened abruptly, and he lay still as a corpse, his breath coming rapid and shallow, listening for the sound to be repeated, or maybe for the flimsy walls of the tent to collapse under the weight of a huge paw. Was this how it would end for him? 13 years of life snuffed out by a bear? The ranger they had talked to had said there were still bears in some areas, so they were to be sure and hang their food supply from a tree branch 10 feet or more above the ground. How big did that make that bear then? If 8 feet or 9 was not beyond their reach? A twig snapped somewhere nearby, and Timothy held his breath. After a long moment, he heard the woofing sound again, almost in his ear. He let out his breath in an explosive sigh, realizing with a combination of relief and disgust that what he had heard was his father giving an abbreviated snore. Rolling over on his back, Timothy untangled the sleeping bag, which had insisted on rolling with him, and lay looking up at the roof of the tent, watching for it to grow red again in the first daylight, wishing he were staring up at familiar cracks and stains on the ceiling of his bedroom. That ceiling was a world of its own, nearly as real to him and more friendly than the usual one in which he slept and ate meals and read books and went to school. It was a map of a world, really depicting an enormous and mysterious water-stained continent with cracked plaster rivers running through it. In the borderlands that extended down one wall lay a peeled wallpaper lake and dusky forests that looked, in a certain way, were merely a pattern in the wallpaper. The thing the map did not reveal was whether or not there were people on that island continent, dwelling in clearings in its forests, navigating its rivers. Timothy felt there must be, though they were of a different sort from those who populated his own world. Probably they were simple, easygoing people who picked their food from trees and sat around telling stories. But then, of course, you could never tell how much from a map. The Adirondacks, too, were no more than a greenish pattern when looked at on the New York map in the road atlas, just as Elmira was nothing more than an orange blot. When his father had first proposed the camping trip, neither Timothy nor his mom had liked the idea. But his mom said, pointing at the map, "Oh, well, look, there are towns and everything up there. It's not like you'd be in the middle of nowhere." "Towns," Timothy said sarcastically. "Oh, sure, I bet North Wilmer is a biggie." Unperturbed, his father ran a finger along the red veins of road, tracing the best route. "We're not going there to window shop. We're going to camp, to rough it, to commute with nature." His mother sighed. I don't know, Jerry. Isn't it cold at night in August up there? How are you going to stay warm? You know how easily Timmy gets sick. He always has. Oh, you stay warm by cutting wood and burning it. It'll be good for him. Build him up a little. He punched Timothy's arm playfully. Ow, Tim said. Something was nudging his arm again now, and he sat upright in the mummy bag, alarmed. It must be the bear. To his surprise, the interior of the tent was glowing red with daylight. The flap was lifted, and his father was grinning at him. Jumpy, aren't you? What time is it? Timothy mumbled. It's time to get up. You want to catch fish? You've got to get an early start. What if I don't want it? His father shrugged. Then I guess you don't eat. You mean we're going to have fish for breakfast? It'll sound good once you've been up for an hour or two. His father finished pulling on thigh-high waders and clomped off to sea to his fishing tackle. Fish for breakfast? Timothy grumbled, and rooting his glasses out from among his clothes, slipped them on and checked his watch. 6 o'clock! Shoot! How did his father expect him to get built up if he didn't let him get any sleep? He considered flopping back into the sleeping bag, but he knew his father would just come back and rout him out again, and this time he'd be a-yellin'. It probably wasn't worth it. Besides, he promised his mom to try and get along. He's making an effort, she said. You've got to make an effort too. Couldn't he find some other way? Timothy had said. Why couldn't he just be home once in a while? She hadn't answered, but he knew the answer anyway because they'd had the same argument a number of times. It was the business. When you owned a construction company, you had to hustle or somebody else got the job. Hustle, bustle, muscle. Timothy kicked the sleeping bag off and climbed into his clothes, trying to hustle. It was hard to do within the confines of the tent, but if he stepped outside, he'd get covered with leaves and dirt. Finally, he crammed his feet into his new hiking boots and emerged from the tent like a fledgling butterfly from its cocoon, just as his father was heading for the tent again, prepared to yell. His father should have looked ridiculous in the clumsy waders and worn vest and floppy hat with artificial flies stuck in the band, but he didn't. He looked like he just stepped off the cover of Field and Stream. Some people just look that way all the time, like they were living in a commercial. His brother Kevin was the same way, except where his dad belonged in a Budweiser commercial or maybe Wranglers, Kevin was more the Mountain Dew type. Pepsi, clean cut, always grinning, always acting like he'd never even heard of dandruff or bad breath or acne. The only commercial that could conceivably have contained Timothy was maybe the one for that video game where the kids were all kind of fat or nerdy looking. Not that he was fat exactly, just a little on the flabby side. You didn't get all that exercise that the guys in commercials got, chasing after girls who stole their cowboy hats and jumping headlong into mountain pools and playing soccer. Kevin played soccer. In fact, he was already a rising star at Syracuse in his freshman year. He would have been just as good probably at baseball or track, but they didn't seem as much like a commercial. His father looked his disheveled, rumpled son over. Where's your pole? In the car, I guess. Well, don't just stand there. Go get it. It's late in the day for good fishing. Late? Timothy said to himself as he trotted to the Jeep. If it was any earlier, the fish couldn't see the bait. When he got to the vehicle, he realized he needed the keys to open the rear door. So he trotted back to where his father stood, flicking his fly rod impatiently. What now? Keys, said Timothy. With them in hand, he returned and opened the back of the Jeep. As he lifted his pole out from behind the spare tire, he saw that a foot-long piece of it had been broken off, presumably by closing the door. It dangled on the end of the fishing line. Oh, crap, he groaned, and stuck the broken back piece on the end of the rod. It promptly fell off again. As he started away from the Jeep, he noticed his father gesturing, but he was almost halfway to him before he understood the message. The door! Close the door and bring the keys. Timothy sighed and turned back. This was going to be some terrific day. His father long-sufferingly whittled off the pole at the second eyelet, and they hiked through about a mile of dew-wet grass to the river. The original plan had been to camp at Moose Lake, where his father had gone on a fishing trip years before with his own dad, Timothy's grandfather. But things had changed in the intervening years. Moose Lake and a lot of others were gradually losing their fish population, thanks to the acid rain produced by pollutants borne on the wind from Midwestern factory smokestacks. So they settled for a spot on the Independence River. Unfortunately, if there were still fish in the river, they chose not to reveal themselves today. After nearly 2 hours of waiting around and flinging every sort of fly in his arsenal into every square inch of a 100-yard stretch of river, while Timothy stood shivering in his wet hiking boots on the bank and plied the water with a single bedraggled spinner, his father gave up, growling, "I knew we should have got here an earlier start." Back in camp, after trying for some time to start a fire with damp branches, they lit up the Coleman stove and fried slices of bread and canned lunch meat and discussed how early they should rise the following morning. After that, there didn't seem to be much talk about. But then that was the way it was always. Even in those few hours a day that his father spent with the family, he did most of his talking to Timothy's mom about money, or to Kevin about ball, either foot or base, depending on the season. For a while, Timothy had tried watching the pro games on TV, but the first time he spoke knowingly about the New York Mets' great defense, they laughed at him and he gave up and went back to reading Robert Louis Stevenson, waiting fiercely for the moment when one of them would slip up and say, "Stevenson, didn't he write A Tale of Two Cities?" He'd laugh so hard. But of course, they never said anything. And even if they had, they would not have been the least embarrassed. They would only have turned it around somehow so that Timothy would be the one to feel stupid for even caring who wrote what. As he sat on the log, sweating and swatting at gnats, watching his father tie new and more irresistible flies, Timothy wished for a cold drink and a copy of The Black Arrow. But his father had flatly refused to bring along such decadent luxuries as ice and books. It would be interesting to see if the old man could really make it through an entire week without a cold beer. Well, anyway, that was one thing that could be said for roughing it. It made you really appreciate the small things you took for granted. Early in the afternoon, bored to exhaustion, Timothy dug up a few worms and went to dangle them in the river for want of anything better to do. After 10 minutes, when nothing had taken his bait, he laid the pole in the grass and leaned up against a sapling to daydream. No sooner had he settled himself than the shortened end of the pole dipped toward the water. He lunged for it and, reeling furiously, pulled in a small but very feisty sunfish. Once he had it off the hook, he didn't quite know what to do with it, so he laid it carefully in the shade and baited the hook again. There was an instant replay, and he pulled in the fish's twin. Then, within half an hour, 4 of his brothers and sisters. Half proud and half plain surprised, he carried his catch back to camp gingerly in his arms, having neglected to bring along a creel or stringer. Grinning sheepishly, he called out as he entered the clearing, "Look at this, Dad. I caught us dinner." "You what?" His father turned irritably from a fly he was fooling with. "You caught something." Timothy crouched down to show him the gaping, glassy-eyed fish. "Oh, just sunfish." His father turned back to his fly. "They're not worth the trouble to clean." "Well, I'll clean them if you show me how." "I said it wasn't the trouble. You should have just thrown them back." "It's something anyhow. It's fish, isn't it?" Tomorrow we'll catch some bass. That's real fish." Timothy looked down at the dead sunfish. "Well, what should I do with them then?" "I don't know. Just toss them off in the bushes someplace. Better take them away off where they won't be attracting wild animals." He glanced up at Timothy. "And you better wash out that shirt too, or it's gonna smell." When he had disposed of the fish and washed the shirt, Timothy wandered around aimlessly for a while. Finally, finding himself on the overgrown logging trail that answered for a road, he ambled down to the Jeep and slid into the passenger side. Inside, it was like a small man-made oasis, clean and comfortable and sheltered. Sometimes at home, he went out and sat in the Jeep or the station wagon and, leafing through the road atlas, pretended he was on a route to some other place, somewhere more interesting, California maybe, or Florida. Almost always it was someplace near the ocean, but not a remote place, a place with great stretches of yellow beach and orange and banana trees you could pick the fruit from. This time, though, he didn't bother to pull the atlas out of the glove compartment. He was pretending the Jeep sat in the driveway at home, and that any time he wanted, he could go indoors and pour a Coke and pick up the Man in the Iron Mask. It was a difficult thing to imagine, even with his eyes closed, for instead of the reassuring sound of the neighbor's dog barking, he heard the wind in the grass and the occasional eerie scream of some bird in the direction of the river. After a time, growing restless, Timothy reached over and, clicking the ignition switch to accessory, turned on the radio. He ran the tuner along the whole length of the dial twice before he caught a glimmer of a sound and zeroed in on it. It proved to be the strains of some kind of popular song, but even when he couldn't hear the melody fairly well over the static, the words baffled him. He understood why when the music ended and an announcer's fruity voice said, "Ice Radio Canada, CBF Montreal." No wonder he couldn't make it out. It was in French. Though he had a year of the language in school, he never got any better than a C in it. It wasn't that he was dumb exactly, it was just that he couldn't work up much enthusiasm about knowing how to say "I'm sleepy" and "it's raining" and "where is the railroad station?" There were enough people going around saying boring and trivial stuff in English without some of them learning to say it in French too. He sighed and said the only French expletive he knew, "merde," and twirled the tuning knob around. Thinking he heard a faint word, he jiggled it delicately, trying to bring them in. When he heard the voice again, he realized it was coming from the outside car. Turning down the volume, he listened until he heard it. "Timothy!" The voice came from the camp. "Yo, Timothy!" Timothy swung open the door of the Jeep and yelled back, "What?" "Get up here!" "What now?" he muttered to himself, and jumping out, he slammed the door shut and strode up the hill to where the tent sat. His father had pounded six head high stakes upright in the sandy soil and laid poles across them. Now he was trying to stretch a huge plastic tarp over the top of the frame. "What are you making?" Timothy asked. "Grab the other end of that," his father said shortly. Timothy took hold of the tarp at one corner. "Not there, in the middle." Timothy moved down a couple of feet. "The middle, and use both hands." The wind caught at the tarp and yanked it from Timothy's grasp. "I said grab it, now grab it!" Finally, his father anchored one corner and, pushing Timothy out of the way, proceeded to tie down the opposite corner, then the remaining ones. "There," he said, more civil now. "Our own outdoor cafe. A couple of logs for a table and one for a bench, and we'll be sitting pretty." "Seems like a lot of trouble for just a couple of days," Timothy said. "A couple of days? We've got more in a week, buddy." "Oh," said Timothy dully. "I thought..." "What?" "I don't know. I just thought we'd do something else for a few days." "Like what?" Oops, sorry. My hand got numb. "I don't know. See some country, stay at a motel, take in a movie, I don't know." "Aw, you can do that kind of stuff at home." His father clapped a hand at Timothy's shoulder. "Let's round up some firewood and cook supper."